obviously, like I pointed out just now, she had visited Genome Valley in 2017, about three plus years ago. And we also have had a couple of interactions with her when she was heading ICMR. And just a pleasure and delight to have you, ma'am, with us. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you very much for your time. We have with us Mahima Datla of Biological E. We have Anand Kumar of Indian Immunologicals. And we also have Dr. Krishna Ella of Bharat Biotech. As we all know, this is an unprecedented time. These are uncharted waters for all of us, in fact, without an exception. So this is an exciting time also from the perspective of, just believing that every adversity has an inherent opportunity that lies within. And today, Hyderabad and our life sciences ecosystem here is truly fortified its position, has really shown its strength to the world, not only from our pharmaceutical sector, but also from our biotechnology and vaccine manufacturing facilities in Hyderabad. I'm proud to share with you that Hyderabad continues to remain, one of the leaders in vaccine manufacturing. We, in fact, today manufacture more than 1/3 vaccines that are used globally. And we also have, in fact, like I pointed out, been home to pharma companies which have been producing the drugs such as Remdesivir, Favipiravir, etc., which have all been in news in the last few months. Delighted that Hyderabad's ecosystem, more particularly the three companies which are right here with us, are leading the vaccine race. There are more than 150 vaccines that are currently under development at various stages across the world. But within India, we have 6 companies that are in the race. And out of those 6, I'm proud to share with you, 4 of them actually are headquartered in Hyderabad. And 3 of them are sitting right here with us. So I'm here more to learn from them. I'm here more to understand from them, like every other layman out there in India and elsewhere, on what is happening in today's world and what is happening in the vaccine manufacturing and also other developments with respect to COVID and this pandemic. We'll get started, in fact, with Dr. Swaminathan. Did we lose her? Dr. Swaminathan? Soumya-ji? We'll get started with you, ma'am. Ma'am, you'll have to unmute yourself. We'll get started with you.
Yes.
Yeah. Ma'am, just a quick, initial thoughts. A lot of data, a lot of research, a lot of articles. These days, with WhatsApp and, social media being all pervasive, everybody seems to know everything. But let me get it from the Chief Scientist of World Health Organization. How long do you think we have to learn to live with this? Because I think that realization has dawned upon all of us that we have to coexist with the virus for a bit. But how long do you think we have to live with this? How long do you think we have to coexist? How do you see the future panning out over the next few months at least?
Yes. No. Thank you very much, Minister. First of all, congratulations on organizing this program today. I think it's very timely. The discussion on vaccines really needs to happen at different levels, both globally and nationally. I'd like to tell you a little bit about what we are doing and how we are thinking about it, and also answer your question about how long will this last and what else should we be doing. Maybe I can start with that. We know now that this novel coronavirus has established itself in the world. It has gone into practically every country. And wherever it has found a situation where it's able to spread easily from person to person, it has established community transmission, and it just goes through the population because we do not have much of pre-existing immunity to this. Now, I will add a caveat there because we are still learning about the immunity to this virus. It is possible that previous exposure to some other coronaviruses might offer some protection. That is one of the questions which are still open, and can only be answered if we study cohorts of people right through and establish cohorts and see who are the people who get more severe infection versus less severe infection. Why do children appear to be relatively less susceptible to disease? They do get the infection, but they don't get sick most of the time. And why is it that with increasing age and with some of the comorbidities, we see increasing severity and increasing mortality? And how long is the immunity going to last after natural infection? We know now that most people who have natural infection develop neutralizing antibodies, and they also seem to develop T-cell immunity. So both the cellular and the humoral immune system is activated. But what we don't know is when do these antibodies start reducing, and for how long is there protective immunity? And this has implications for vaccines. If long-lasting immunity cannot be achieved after a natural infection, with the vaccine, again, we'll have to see. Because the vaccine is targeting, right now, all the vaccines are targeting the spike protein. The first generation vaccines are all targeting the spike protein because it's the most immunogenic protein of the virus. The only risk is if the virus develops a mutation which causes it to escape the immunity which is conferred by the antibodies against the spike protein, then we are in a difficulty. So the second generation of vaccines actually is targeting other antigens as well. So we need also backup plan. And the second thing which we can only do when we introduce the vaccine into phase 3 trials and follow people is to see how long is the immunity going to last, the protective immunity. Whether it's a sterilizing immunity or it's only a disease-modifying immunity, both types could happen with different vaccine candidates. So the message I would like to give right at the beginning is that for the foreseeable future, at least for the next 12 months, we need to put in place the public health and social measures that have been shown to work. And this is at the level of the government, the community, and the individual. Most countries who have controlled the virus successfully in the first phase have been because of good governance, good strategic planning based on scientific knowledge and based on evidence, and because of involvement of community and individual trust, good communication between the government and the people, clear communication, and being prepared to manage what is likely to happen in the future. We know that lockdowns are a temporary measure which reduces the spread because you prevent people from getting close together. And the idea of the lockdown was to buy time for the government to put in place the systems needed to tackle the virus. And I strongly believe, and the WHO has been repeatedly emphasizing the fact that testing is extremely important. Unless we test adequately, we don't know where the virus is. And Dr. Tedros once used the phrase, fighting a fire blindfolded. If you do not test, it's like fighting a fire blindfolded. We have to test and test and test. But testing alone is not going to solve the problem. It's the first step. That, of course, has to be followed by isolation of positive people, contact tracing, quarantining, taking care of those who are positive, following them to make sure that they don't get into the interstitial pneumonia and complications by monitoring their oxygen saturation. So it's a comprehensive package which needs to be put in place, particularly in those places where there is a high density of population, so the cities, for example. In the rural areas, it will be good to have some kind of a surveillance going on so that you know what is going on. This surveillance is usually done in the form of influenza-like illness surveillance or severe acute respiratory illness surveillance, what we call as ILI and SARI surveillance. If everybody who comes in with symptoms suggestive of influenza or of pneumonia is also tested for COVID-19, apart from other infections, like you can do a combined influenza COVID test, then you have a sort of a constant surveillance going on in the rural areas to know which districts, which villages are seeing infections going up. But in the cities, the only way out is to expand testing. India as a whole, the testing rates are much lower compared to some of the countries who have done well, like Germany, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan. Even the United States is testing huge number of people every day. So we need to have some benchmarks. I think every public health department needs to have benchmarks on what is the rate of testing per lakh or per million. What is the test positivity rate? The moment your test positivity rate is above 5%, you know that we are not testing adequately. And then also looking constantly and monitoring the availability of beds, the availability of quarantine facilities, the availability of ICU, oxygen availability in the district hospitals, and so on. So there is a set of about 8 to 10 indicators that the government needs to keep a close watch on, and you can ramp up and ramp down based on what you're seeing on the ground. And the other thing is about the communication to people and what people have to do. It's very nice to see everyone wearing a mask, and I must say I've been impressed in Chennai also, where the mask compliance seems to be very, very high. I'm not sure what it is in the rural areas or in the districts. We need to keep on, because I think wearing a mask properly and using a mask properly is also something people need to learn. If the mask is hanging down below the nose or mouth, it's not going to be effective. But modeling has shown that if everyone wears a mask, you can really cut down on transmission. So it's really a very affordable, cost-effective, and effective measure for people. The other thing is, of course, maintaining distance as far as possible. In some situations, it's less possible because of slum areas and things like that. And also, we know where the clusters can happen. These happen in closed environments where people spend time together. So that is why you have to limit the number of people, but you have industries, factories, other kinds of places, even offices, where people just have to go because you have to restart your economy. That is where then you need to, again, to have a surveillance mechanism, temperature monitoring, making sure everybody is masked, making sure that people maintain the distance, that they have the respiratory etiquette, etc. So it's a very painstaking process, all of these steps, if they have to be implemented properly, but they do bear fruit and they do give results if done. Now over to vaccines, because that's what everybody is looking at as an exit strategy from the pandemic. Let's hope that several of the vaccine candidates in testing, today there are 27, I think, or 28 vaccines that are in clinical trials, and another 150 odd which are in preclinical testing. At least 5 are now entering phase 3 trials. So we will know in the next few months about the safety and efficacy of these vaccines. And I emphasize safety as very important, because to get public trust, when you are going to vaccinate huge numbers of healthy individuals, the safety bar of the vaccine has to be set quite high in order for it to be acceptable and usable in the population. So things like the disease enhancement, which is something which has happened previously with other vaccines, and other rare side effects that you notice only when tens of thousands of people have been vaccinated, those have to be really followed up. So one of the things we need to prepare for is a pharmacovigilance strategy and mechanisms, not just during the clinical trial, but after licensure and after it starts getting used widely. We need to keep an eye for the next couple of years on the safety profile of this vaccine. Efficacy, of course, is important, and the WHO has already put out guidance on what we consider as acceptable efficacy. So it would be good to have a vaccine with at least 70% efficacy minimum of 50%, but with a lower bound of efficacy not falling below 30%. Because modeling has shown that anything below 50% efficacious vaccine is not going to have much of a public health impact. So that's the kind of a benchmark that we hope for. Now, through the ACT Accelerator that WHO launched on April 24th with many, many partners, what we are hoping to do is to speed up the R&D for vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, but also ensure equitable access. So it's not just a question of faster development, but also of fair and equitable access to populations around the world. We do not want to be in a situation which happened during the H1N1 pandemic 2009-10, when a few rich countries bought most of the supplies and stocks of vaccines and only started donating it to the lower income countries when they realized that infection probably wasn't as serious or severe as it was supposed to be, and they had excess stocks. Now, if that happens again this time, then I think all of us would have failed. What we hope to do is to, as vaccines become available, to distribute them across the world to protect those who are the most vulnerable, the frontline workers, the health workers, the others who are at highest risk of getting infection, then the vulnerable group within the community, and then go to the rest of the population as the stocks become more and more available. So the COVAX initiative, which is WHO, CEPI, and Gavi, aims to have 2 billion doses of the vaccine by end of 2021. A realistic timeline to start getting the first millions of doses would be the first half of 2021. But then will come the distribution, the delivery, and then for countries to be able to start vaccinating their populations. This is something that ministries are already looking at. They are drawing up their policies. They're looking at supply chain and other logistics that will be needed. One of the things we don't know is which vaccine will be successful and what the storage conditions will be. There are a couple of vaccines which need to be stored at -70 or -80. Others, hopefully, at 4 to 8 degrees. So we have to be prepared for those. And we have to get agreement between countries. In the next few weeks, actually, we need to get agreement that they will follow the fair allocation mechanism that's being developed by WHO. Side by side, the COVAX facility is being set up by Gavi. This is a risk pooling mechanism where self-financing countries can put in some funds so that they can procure vaccines for their populations. And they are pooling the risk because the COVAX facility will buy vaccines which are going to be proven to be safe and efficacious. And at the same time, the ODA funds will pay for the vaccines which will go to the Gavi-eligible countries. The number of Gavi-eligible countries has been increased now to 92. India, of course, is a Gavi-eligible country, and so should be getting the vaccine doses from the COVAX facility. But India being a hub of manufacturing could also consider how and they are going to really interact with the rest of the world and with the COVAX facility in terms of sharing of the vaccines that are going to be produced in India, and a lot of them are going to be produced in Hyderabad.
Yes, ma'am. In fact,
we are fortunate that Mahima is on the panel. She's on the board for the COVAX facility. There's a coordinating mechanism, and she represents the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers Association. So we have a strong voice from India on that board as we shape it up and as it moves. As I said, the next few weeks are going to be quite critical. Over to you, Minister.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. In fact, like you pointed out, India continues to remain a hub for vaccine manufacturing. And within India, Telangana and Hyderabad have been, on the forefront. And today, like I pointed out, more than 1/3 of global vaccines are produced from Genome Valley in Hyderabad. So we're very proud, and all the very, very pertinent points you made. Thank you very much. But one quick thing before I turn, quick question before I turn to the panel here, of the industry leaders. Yesterday, I had read a statement from the World Health Organization chief saying that while a vaccine, the hope for a vaccine is very real and it might happen, there is also an equal chance that there could never be a vaccine. Can you help us understand this? Because, vaccine in current situation seems to be a ray of hope, but there must be a reason, there must be a logic. I'm sure the industry here will never, possibly agree with whatever was said, but nevertheless, help us understand why or what would prompt someone to say, like in the case of HIV, how there could never be a vaccine. In case of COVID as well, it was pointed out yesterday that there also is a chance, however fat or slim it is, that there could never be a vaccine. Is that a fair reasoning, fair thought process? What are your thoughts?
So I think the experts who are sitting with you know very well that vaccine development is a risky business and that success is not assured. We have many diseases for which we don't have vaccines, in spite of a lot of R&D having been done over decades, like HIV, TB, malaria, etc. We have so far not had a vaccine for a coronavirus. So this is a new endeavor. So we are optimistic because of the efforts going into it and because of the number of different platforms that are being tested. But we haven't understood the virus completely. And so there is always a possibility that we don't get it right or that it takes longer. We may not get it right the first time. It may take longer. And that is why I think the DG is warning people, do not believe that the problem is going to be solved in 6 months or 12 months. We don't know that for sure. Unless we see results from the phase 3 efficacy trials, and unless we follow people up to see how long they are protected for, we really can't say that this problem is going to come to an end in 2021 or 2022. So I think he's preparing people to think longer term and to think about public health, vaccine being one part of the battle. Vaccine is not the silver bullet, I think is what he said. Drugs are also important and new drugs are being also tested because that can bring down the severity, that can prevent death. So that's a very important one. And new diagnostics also, like the antigen detection tests, etc., saliva tests will help.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Now let me turn to the industry leaders here. We'll start with Dr. Krishna L. of Bharat Biotech as we talk about the race for vaccine development, as we talk about the efficacy of the vaccine, the longevity of its impact, etc., etc. Help me understand, because from a layman's perspective, I am a layman, I would love to understand this. Normally I hear that it would take anywhere from a few years to sometimes even a decade to create and produce a vaccine, because there is a lot of science involved, there is a lot of trials involved, there is a lot of practices involved to make sure that the drug is actually efficient, the vaccine is actually efficient and very, very long in terms of its impact as well. I hope we are not compromising on the science in this pursuit, in this race, in this sort of a rat race, so to speak, of one against another. I hope the science of the vaccine development is not being compromised, is not being adversely impacted. Can you help us understand how you're able to overcome these, typical timelines, etc., and how we are able to now already, because I've been to your facility, Bharat Biotech, in fact, Covaxin and other vaccines that you're currently developing are already nearly in the phase 3 stage. So help us understand how you're taking care of the science behind and ensuring the efficacy of the vaccine is also taken into account before we talk about a full-fledged launch. Help us understand, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Honorable Minister. And we are really proud of Soumya heading the WHO. I think first Indian and first woman candidate heading there. We are proud of you. And I think, the vaccine field takes 14 to 15 years a vaccine to develop. So we are trying to develop in less than 18 months or 12 months in this vaccine. It's complicated. But at the same time, with the vaccine experience, we are also much more cautious. It's not that we are trying to make it a vaccine just to move it fast to the market. No. I think we are putting a lot of intensive research in all 360 degrees, and that is where the partnership is helping us with US, WHO, everybody helping us to look at the critique, some of the scientific aspect of it, so that we don't short circuit the science. That is not there. So we are much more rigorous today. But problem, as Soumya said, the virus is a new one. So it's like a relationship. You need to build a relationship with the virus to understand how this virus behaves. Besides, the people's genetic makeup also is playing a role. As she said, we don't know whether we have, all of us had a respiratory pathogen infection. That might be the reason why we have death rate less in this country compared to the Italy or Spain, where the high death rate. So we might have got a lot of other infections before respiratory pathogens. So I think, we are not short-circuiting in any way the science. And I can tell you, our science is all critiqued by the global community, not by India alone. It's a global community. So rest assured that any of the Hyderabad company or Indian company will short-circuit on science on this matter. That I can assure them.
Thank you, Krishna. In fact, that's very comforting to hear because, while we are all actively wanting a very, very impactful vaccine coming out ASAP, possibly day after tomorrow or yesterday, in fact, the fact is we cannot afford to short circuit, like you put, the whole science behind vaccine development. Now, let me turn over to Mahima. As Dr. Swaminathan pointed out, you're in a very pivotal role right now, representing the developed countries in Gavi. And also, your company biologically has been in vaccine development for more than nearly 5 decades now, and a very, very reputed organization which has known the science. Why don't you walk us through, because again, from a very layman perspective, there are multiple approaches to a vaccine. If there are 150 vaccines that are currently under preparation, etc., what are the different approaches the world is taking? What is the difference between the vaccine that you're currently engaged in vis-a-vis Indian Immunologicals or Covaxin of Bharat or say Serum Institute, etc.? Also talk us through possibly how has vaccine development evolved in the last 5 decades? Because you've been in this business, for the last several decades. So talk us through how scientific developments have helped and possibly how that can be put to good use so that this expeditious delivery that people are anticipating for COVID can be fructified. No, thanks, Mahima. Cheers. Yeah.
I don't know if you can hear me. Okay. So first of all, I think at the heart of it, vaccine development, to put it in really simplistic terms, is really giving your body a bacteria or a virus that's highly purified. So it's basically stimulating what would naturally be the way a disease would be contracted, but in a very controlled fashion such that it's giving your body the ability and the time to raise antibodies and fight the infection naturally. And the reason it needs to be controlled is because it needs to be safe. You don't want a high viral load and so on. So at the crux of it, all vaccines aim to do what nature does itself. All the people recovering from COVID, they're getting exposed to the virus and they're raising antibodies and they're getting protected. So this is a way of simulating that. So all vaccines aim to do that. If I had to classify vaccines into the categories that based on the technology platforms, currently I would classify them into 4. And I'm sorry if there's scientists in the audience, there might be 10, but the way I understand it in my head is into 4 buckets. So the first bucket is viral vaccines that are inactivated. These can be whole virions or the virus itself that's inactivated either chemically or through heat or through other mechanisms. And I believe Bharat Biotech's Covaxin follows that approach, as do several others. The second bucket, I would say, is protein vaccines. So these are the spike proteins, which is the spike on the corona, giving it its name. There's the RBD, the receptor binding domain-based proteins, which play a role in inhibiting the virus attaching itself to the ACE2 receptors in our body. So there's a whole host of vaccines that are targeting spike proteins or the RBD. The third bucket, I would say, also targets spike proteins or RBD. So effectively, it's a protein approach, but it's also driven by new vectors, either modified vaccine Ankaria or the AdVac vectors, and so on. And the fourth bucket, I would say, is the other and really novel technologies, which are your DNA vaccines and RNA vaccines, which is basically like a messenger. It's like coding. It's aimed to deliver a code to your genes and to your RNA to start producing antibodies against the virus. And frankly, it's extremely interesting platform technology, extremely exciting. And I think, you know, DNA and RNA vaccines have been in development for close to 15 years now. But this is really an opportune moment to test that technology. But unlike human beings, not all vaccines are created equal, and each of these come with their own sets of challenges in order to develop. Like Dr. Swaminathan pointed out, some of the new DNA and RNA vaccines need to be kept in minus 70 degrees. Now, these are programmatically extremely challenging. But I do want to talk a little bit about, what we're doing to, have an expeditious vaccine. And in many ways, I agree with Dr. Ella that while there's no trade-offs in science, we are collectively making some trade-offs, because in reality, you would expect a vaccine to be over 90% efficacious. But all of vaccine development, not just now, historically has to be viewed in the context of risk. Now, when you had widespread polio, we agreed to take the risk that when you take OPV vaccine, 1 in X percentage get polio because of the vaccine. But that's because the risk of polio was so high. I think COVID is similar. The fact that WHO put out TPP requirements for 50 to 80% efficacy tells you the trade-off that we're willing to make, but never at the cost of safety, because the last thing you want to do is make a situation even worse. Now, coming to our own candidates, we've been working on an RBD protein candidate, and the expression system we're using is yeast. It's Pichia. It's tried and tested. We've made hundreds of million doses of hepatitis B on that platform. And I think much like ourselves, many companies are choosing platforms that they are familiar with, that they have infrastructure for. Because the key to speed is, 150 candidates are not going to be able to make the vaccine in hundreds of millions of doses. And I think that's very key, to marry the technology with the infrastructure and the track record and capability. Now, our choice of RBD was dictated by the infrastructure match that would best allow us to make vaccine as quickly as possible. And so far, we're going to start phase 1 studies in September, but from the manufacturability perspective, we have enough data that assures us that we'll be in a position to produce 80 to 100 million doses a month of this vaccine from the get-go. I think that's crucial, because in the early years, you're going to have a demand-supply gap and allocations. Everybody is going to fight over it. So it's really important to be able to scale quickly, and when we talk about challenges, we can discuss that. But in my mind, the reason it'll be expeditious is because we are making certain trade-offs in context of risk, but not in relation to safety. We may be making trade-offs in terms of the expectation on timing of protection, because we may say, hey, it's okay if it protects us for 1 year, we'll take it yearly as opposed to a lifetime, but really not at the cost of safety. And the second most important factor is having large-scale infrastructure that you can deploy these technologies into. I hope that answers.
No, absolutely. In fact, before we go to scale, before we talk about how, like Dr. Swaminathan pointed out, some countries tend to hoard, then, at the cost of developing nations, etc. Before we go into that, I think one important question that, is currently sort of has been overlooked in the past but has come to the fore now, is how competition, such as you, all three of you, or in fact other vaccine manufacturers in the country, including Serum and others, in a country like India, where government doesn't spend too much on R&D, government per se does not spend a lot of money on research and development. Of course, we encourage private sector to invest in R&D. We encourage private sector, of course, to take the risk. And of course, the reward also will be that much higher. The fact is,